the thought here is to share the buyer rep agreement. So this is Elevate specific. So I guess my thought first and foremost before we get started in that, because I know Legacy is using a different buyer rep agreement. Rick, are you using Ohio Realtors or are you using similar to Legacy?
No, I think we're using similar to legacies.
Okay. The good news, to me, they're pretty similar. So that's the good news. But yeah, so first and foremost, before we even get started, I want to put it out there. So August 17th is 2 days away. So that is the time for us to start using these buyer rep agreements if you haven't already. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, then it's a good thing you're here. So starting August 17th, in order to show a home, we need a buyer rep agreement signed. So what I've been telling Elevate is we are awaiting a document or verbiage to put together from Ohio Realtors regarding the situation. If we have let's say we have a listing, we get a sign call, the potential buyer is not interested in signing an exclusive right to sell, or I'm sorry, exclusive buyer rep agreement, then in that case, we will have a customer agreement, meaning that we're not exclusively representing them. We're making it known we represent the seller. Yet this is a different way or another form of allowing them to see the home without having an exclusive buyer rep agreement signed. And so before I pull up the agreement, first and foremost, are there any outlying questions that we have before we even get started from anyone that's on the call? Which there's a lot of us. Rich and Rick, do you have anything that you would like to add before we, pull up the agreement?
Well, we don't have that customer. Living doesn't have that customer agreement. Although it sounds like it's probably similar to our unrepresented buyer agreement. So yeah, if we have somebody who's not willing to sign that buyer rep agreement, we're going to have them sign that unrepresented buyer.
Okay, perfect.
So when you say that you have a buyer that refuses to sign the buyer agent agreement, you're saying that when the listing agent wants to show the property. Or are you
Correct.
saying, yeah, okay.
Correct.
I just want to be
Correct.
clear because it's not an option for a buyer to not sign that if you're going out and showing them houses unless you are the listing agent exclusively. Okay.
Yes, I appreciate that, Rich. Yes. Okay, so let me share. Pull it over here. So as I said before, this will be different for Legacy and for Living. However, to me, it's going to be pretty similar. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. Okay, so first and foremost, I'll read the first paragraph. I'm not going to read through literally everything, but I think it's really important to read. So this is a legally binding agreement establishing exclusive agency relationship between the buyer and brokerage, establishing the buyer's obligation to compensate the brokerage. If buyer does not understand the agreement, they should seek the advice of an attorney. The exclusive agency relationship set forth in the agreement means that the buyer agrees to be exclusively represented by the brokerage identified here. The agreement grants the right to represent during the term identified below, subject to the terms of the agreement. The buyer understands that if the buyer enters into multiple buyer rep agreements, the buyer could be liable for paying multiple fees on the same transaction. So to me, this is what I've been stressing. I think this is a really good thing, a really positive thing, because it's almost as if it's a filter to filter out those buyers that are actually serious from those that are not. And then secondly, to create the relationship, the agency relationship between us and the buyers as well, for them to know and understand that, this is a partnership. We're working together to help them find a home. And maybe in the past, they might have just called whatever agent was available to show them something. And, those days to me, because of these agreements now being mandated, hopefully those days are over. So scrolling down, so line 7, so this is the agreement between, so we're putting the names of the agents, and then this is Keller Williams Elevate, obviously, and then the undersigned buyer. So the buyer signs at the end. So purpose of the agreement is to establish the agency relationship between buyer brokerage. The buyer hereby grants brokerage exclusive right to locate real property on behalf of that buyer and to assist in negotiations for its purchase or acquisition, as set forth below. So to me, if we're meeting a buyer for a first time, my recommendation is first and foremost, we're having a consultation with that buyer to go over this document and also to set expectations and understand what it is that they're, what's important to them. So for line number 1, my recommendation is to put in, it could be very general as far as looking for a single family home in Northeast Ohio. However, if there's that scenario where we just met the buyer and we need to have this signed so they could see a house, we could put a specific property on this as well. So it's kind of, it can go both ways as far as being generic or being very specific. The term for the, so line 15, term, so the agreement is for the period beginning on, so, that should be the date that this is being signed, and ending on whatever date is established. As far as recommendations for time frame, it's up to you, it's your business. However, if this was me filling it out, I would want at least a 6-month relationship with the buyer. It could even be 12 months too. It really just depends on the feel you get with the buyer. Rich and Rick, do you have any thoughts around that as far as the term and time frame?
No, I think you're going to see agents take advantage of doing a 1-day or a 3-day. It depends on how much a consumer actually wants to sign this. So originally we were training, get a 3-month, get a 6-month, but at the same time, to your point, if you get a call today at noon that says a buyer wants to go look at a house at 6 o'clock and they just want to get in, you still have to have them sign this. And so you might be more apt to do a 1 week. And then if they like you, they'll sign a longer one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or even making this into a non-exclusive by making it a 1-day exclusive, which is essentially a non-exclusive. So if you've got like an investor or something like that, somebody who's not ready to commit and you still want to work with them, you can do a short term just to make it essentially a non-exclusive.
Okay. And so, the duties and services of the brokerage, to me, this is really important to go through with the buyer. And this is really at the point that you're demonstrating and instructing them regarding the value that you're bringing to this. We all know how much work we do with buyers. It's only at the beginning to show them the properties and then eventually get under contract. But once we're under contract, the amount and time and energy and effort that we put into these buyers, I mean, to me, these are all key points, to go through, to mention to them and just make sure that they're aware of. So section 4 is contemporaneous offers. So here at Elevate, we have an addendum for this. So what contemporaneous offers means is I have buyer A I'm working with, I have buyer B that I'm working with. There could be a situation where both of these buyers are making an offer on the same property, with me representing them both. It's just making them known. We have the addendum that, hey, I'm just letting you know, I have a different buyer. I'm not sharing any of your information, your offer information with that other buyer. And same goes for, buyer A or buyer B. So this is just explaining that could be a situation. To me, it's rare, yet it does happen. So dual agency. Rich and Rick, do your brokerages allow dual agency?
Yes.
We allow it, I discourage it.
Yes. So same here. I mean, there are situations where, dual agency does happen, yet I'm not a big fan of it either. However, so on this agreement, we're having the buyer consent or not consent as far as having their agent do dual agency. So dual agency would be the situation, I have the listing, and then also this buyer's interested in offering on this listing. So in that scenario, I could potentially become a dual agent. If they do not consent, as far as that, so my suggestion then would be to refer the buyer to a different agent in that scenario, to have that agent then help the buyer submit an offer on that listing. All right, duties of the buyer. So during the term of the agreement, the buyer agrees to use the brokerage exclusively in the buyer's search for such real property and all subsequent negotiations for the purchase or acquisition. Buyer agrees to cooperate, including promptly providing brokerage with any pertinent information requested by the brokerage. Buyer agrees to not interfere with our efforts to accomplish the purpose set forth in the agreement. Buyer agrees to not record video or photographs of the property without the seller's written consent. Buyer is advised that some sellers may have audio and or video surveillance that could be used to monitor conversations. So the next paragraph is what I love right here. It says buyer, so they would be initialing this. Buyer represents that they have not entered into any exclusive or non-exclusive representation agreements that could be in conflict with this agreement. So to me, this is another point, like I'm glad it's in bold, because to me, it's extremely important to ask the question. And, I've seen scenarios and situations previously where the buyer has stated, oh, we didn't even know we signed this. So to me, the fact that they're initialing this, and we should be asking, have you signed an exclusive buyer rep agreement prior to this, is so important. It'll be very interesting as we, implement these buyer rep agreements to see the policing of them and all that, but that's for us brokers, along with the, specific situations you might have to deal with. Yeah, I love that this section, for them to initial is in here.
Rob, we had the MLS at the Starboard yesterday, and they shared that every 15th closing, they are going to be auditing these buyer agency agreements, rep agreements with realtors. So buyers agents will actually have to send it in, and they'll have to verify that it was signed before the showing. So
Yeah, and also keep in mind too, that means the consumer guide to agency is being signed at the same time of this buyer rep agreement, or it should be. What I've told agents as well is it might have been more challenging to have a buyer sign a buyer rep or an exclusive buyer rep agreement prior, because not everyone was doing it. So they would just find a different agent that wouldn't use these. However, in 2 days from now, it's going to be mandatory. So that conversation's a lot different now. So compensation, buyer understands that broker fees and commissions are not set by law, are fully negotiable, and may be paid by seller, buyer, landlord, the tenant, or a third party, or by sharing or splitting the fees and commissions between the brokers. That verbiage is what is now, at least for Elevate, it's in our purchase agreement. It's in this exclusive buyer rep agreement. We even added it, well, it's in our exclusive right to sell, and we also added it to our purchase agreement. So this is part of the settlement verbiage that needed to be disclosed to buyers or sellers that we're representing. So for our agreements, and I imagine Legacy and Livings is pretty similar. However, so they are initialing and the rate of, and so what we have is a percentage of the purchase price, the lease, or the option price of any real property acquired by the buyer. Rich and Rick, do you guys have the percentage of purchase price, or is yours kind of open-ended? Just curious.
well, it can't be open-ended, so we don't have that, but it does have a percent or a flat rate. Either one is
Okay.
available.
I guess that's what I meant. Yeah. Not open-ended, but yeah, just a flat rate. Okay.
And ours is similar to, yeah, it has the percentage, and it has both the dollar amount and a percentage and also a minimum. So
Okay.
yeah, so you can put your 295 and the percent.
Yeah, and so, this is for Elevate specifically under the additional terms. It came up regarding minimum amount. So my recommendation for those at Elevate would be to then put in under additional terms what the minimum amount, of commission would be. And then we also have here line 58, our additional brokerage commission of 295. All right, so 61 through 68. So parties agree and understand that any compensation made payable pursuant to the agreement is payable to the brokerage. Parties agree and understand that the brokerage has earned commission as stated in paragraph 7 if during the term of the buyer rep agreement or in terms of the agreement of the buyer, any assignee of the buyer, or any person or legal entity acting on behalf of that buyer directly or indirectly enters into the agreement to purchase, option, lease, or exchange. And so point A, the purchase or acquisition occurs during the stated term of the agreement. Buyer and brokerage have not terminated the agreement prior to entering into a purchase agreement, or the purchase or acquisition occurs within X amount of days, calendar days, of the end of the stated term of the agreement, and the buyer became aware of the purchase or acquired real property during the stated term of this agreement. As far as how many calendar days, my suggestion would be 6 months. Again, this could be shortened, it could be lengthened. Rich and Rick, do you have any recommendations as far as time frame?
Ours is pre-printed at 30 days.
30 days.
Yeah, and we're telling agents anywhere between 30 and 60 days.
Okay. All right, so buyer agrees and consents if a listing agent or seller or any third party offers a buyer's agent compensation to the brokerage, then the brokerage shall make a reasonable effort to obtain said compensation. So I'm going to stop right there. I think what's really important along with this agreement is for everyone to understand the buyer compensation agreement and disclosure. I believe all 3 of our brokerages have that same form or are using that same form. On that form, it states we're receiving commission from the listing brokerage or from the seller or from the buyer. It's really important to understand the differences between the 3. So for instance, if I have a buyer who signed this agreement, my recommendation is to call the list agent to understand if there's a co-broke commission being offered. If there is, then that would be commission coming from the listing brokerage. If there's not anything being offered by the listing brokerage and we show the home, the buyer loves it, they want to make an offer, then it could be different. It could be we could in our offer in that buyer compensation agreement, we could put in that we still want the seller to pay whatever the percentage is, say 3%. So that would be coming directly from the seller in that case because nothing was offered up front. Or lastly, let's just say the seller refuses to offer any type of compensation or commission, or it wouldn't be compensation, but it'd be commission. In that case, then we would fall back on this buyer rep agreement and whatever stated here as far as if I scroll up to the percentage, we just want to make sure we do not go above whatever percentage is put in, on line 56 here. So if I put, 2.5%, and let's just say that the seller's offering 3, you'll see at the bottom of this agreement, there is a place to amend it. However, technically, unless it's amended, we cannot ask or we cannot obtain higher than what this number percentage is in this agreement. Anything, Rich and Rick, you want to add to that? Because I think it's really important. I've already had an agent call me. It was yesterday morning. She showed a property and asked the list agent what if the seller was offering compensation, and basically the list agent said maybe. And to me, there needs to be further clarification because we need to know when we put together the offer, is the listing brokerage offering a co-broke commission? If they are, that's great. If they're not, then it's different, because then, if they're not, so then it would be coming from the seller if we're asking the seller to pay the commission. So unfortunately, there's a lot of agents out there, and I just think that it's going to take some time to really understand, what each means. And I think that it's great that we're all here together to be able to educate ourselves, and then be able to, I guess, in some instances, educate agents that aren't necessarily aware of the differences and the nuances between them. Anything, Rich and Rick, you want to add to the commission structure as far as coming from the listing co-broke, or from the listing brokerage versus seller versus buyer?
I just told my agents on that form, because that form can be confusing with between seller paid commissions and listing agent paid commissions. I've told my agents, I don't really care which one if the buyer's not paying you, you can put it either way. If you put it as seller and it should have been the listing broker, they'll correct it, and there's no problem with changing it. The only time I'm worried about a seller changing it is if they're changing it to the buyer side. Then we got to know about that. But whether it's seller or listing agent, I think it's for your buyer, it doesn't really matter.
The only time I would say that that matters is if on our side, any of us receiving it, if it says listing broker and we miss that and we aren't really offering compensation, if we all signed it, guess what? We just offered compensation that we didn't procure from the seller. So we have to be really careful on how that's filled out on when we receive a purchase agreement ourselves, because we are the listing company then. And if for some reason we miss that, everyone agreed that we're paying a commission. So you may have accepted X commission and you may get zero because you've given it all away. So that's the only thing I would say, Rick, to your point, is it does make sense. Either way, it's typically coming from the seller, whether the listing agent procured it or the seller is paying it. But if the listing agent didn't procure it and that's the box that's marked and the listing agent doesn't fix it and the seller says I wasn't paying anything, the listing broker is going to pay it. So just an FYI, be careful when we're receiving it.
Yeah, and I would say too, so our exclusive right to sell ties in, perfectly, as far as this is, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you're offering 6%. Our listing brokerage based off of that 6%, we're offering 3%. So, it states it right then and there. So then, yeah, to your point, Rich, I think it's really important to make sure that we understand when we receive, that, whatever offers, that it's apples to apples and it's the same.
Yeah, I would say for living, if we're on the listing side of it, it's coming from the seller. The way our listing agreement is written, it shouldn't be coming from the listing brokerage. It's coming from the seller, the way that we have our exclusive right to sell written.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's I'm happy you added that, because we're all still a little bit different, which, I mean, that's perfectly fine, and that's just how it is. So the rest of the paragraph, so it's just really important to understand it. It's just stating that if the seller or listing brokerage is offering compensation, we're going to do our best to have that be part of it, to reduce, or to make up that gap between what's agreed to with this buyer rep agreement, and then also, between what they're offering. So we're going to do our best to make sure that that's part of the offer that we're sending, based off of what's being offered by the listing brokerage or seller. So here at the bottom again, so buyer should inform the brokerage if buyer is subject to any other agency relationship in any property shown to buyer by any other brokerage, to avoid the possibility of owing compensation to more than one brokerage. So it states, what I love, it states in here multiple times, you are not, you are confirming that you are not working with a different, or you don't have an exclusive buyer rep agreement signed with another brokerage. So in here, obviously, is the optional, if the buyer shall provide brokerage an amount of X amount as a non-refundable engagement fee, which brokerage and licensed agent shall deposit promptly and be applied to buyer's compensation under this agreement. Has anyone's I'm just curious, like nothing that I've heard of from our brokerage as far as anyone, doing a, let's just call it a retainer fee or, whatever you want to call it. I have not seen or heard of anyone, but that doesn't mean that's not going to happen. Have Rich or Rick, have you seen anything of that? No. Okay.
Lots of questions about retainers, but we're not doing them at Living. I think that's a very messy proposition with the division and commissions and accounting here in the office. So we're not doing retainers right now.
Yeah, and that actually just triggers in my head too. I don't know if I'm a huge fan of it either, as far as tracking of the funds and all of that. So I can understand that point. So I think that's something for me to think about. So consent to delegation. Buyer delegates the authority for the brokerage to appoint another licensed agent within the same brokerage to act on behalf of that licensed agent. Prior to that appointment, the buyer is notified of such appointment, and buyer has the absolute right to veto any person deemed unsuitable by the buyer. So basically, we're on vacation. Hey, Mr. Buyer, I have this agent, that can fill in for you. Send some type of written communication and get verification that they agree to that. So there's a lot in the chat. I haven't looked at the chat at all. I don't know, Rich or Rick, are there any, I guess, burning questions that?
I've been trying to keep up with questions in there.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right. Professional advice and assistance. So, a lot of the rest of the agreement is a lot of just verbiage as far as protection for the brokerage and for us agents as well. So the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the purchase or lease of the real property encompasses many professional disciplines. While the brokerage and licensed agent possess considerable general knowledge, the brokerage and licensed agents are not experts on matters of law, tax, insurance, financing, surveying, structural conditions, hazardous materials, environmental conditions, so on and so forth. The brokerage advises the buyer, and the buyer acknowledges that they should seek professional expert assistance and advice in these areas of other professional expertise. In the event the brokerage provides to the buyer the names of companies or sources for such advice, assistance, or services, including inspections or repairs, buyer additionally acknowledges and agrees that the brokerage does not warrant, guarantee, endorse the services or products of such companies or sources. So again, it's in there. It's not exactly as far as like what the purchase agreement states, but it to me, these tie hand in hand together with our purchase agreement. So this is the matter as far as dispute resolution. If the brokerage and buyer are unable to resolve any dispute or claim arising out of the agreement within 60 days following the time of dispute or claim, when it's first presented to the other party, the parties agree that any and all disputes or claims will be settled by binding arbitration pursuant to administered under the under the rules of the American Arbitration Association, or such other neutral arbitrator agreed to by parties involved in such dispute. So what I want to state in this, I would say that this is using exclusive buyer rep agreements is new. Well, let me rephrase that. It's not new. There's some agents and brokerages that have used them. Yet, generally speaking, the majority of brokerages and agents have not been using them. So as far as enforceability and as far as arbitration or things of that nature, disputes, to me, we're in uncharted waters. So all I would ask for is to have patience. So I think that bringing the situations and all of us working together to figure things out as different situations arise and different problems come up. I mean, that's the role of us as the principal brokers here, is to help figure them out. But at the same time, this is, in my opinion, this will be uncharted waters for most of us as far as when there's disputes over things of hey, I represented this buyer, or no, I didn't, you know, just things of that nature. Rich and Rick, you have anything to chime in with that?
I think there's going to be tons of disputes. We've already seen at the different brokerages where buyers have come to the table at closing and said, I refuse to pay anything or I'm not closing. We've seen where buyers have had to reduce the commission they can bring simply because they don't have the funds. We've seen where a lender was not aware of the fact that the buyer had to pay anything and it wasn't on the settlement statement. They weren't aware of it. Um, I don't know if there's going to be a spot where buyers can pay with credit card or if buyers can pay with check
Okay.
and it can be outside of closing. There is so much yet to see. I can say that even going over this document, I would not be surprised that in the next 6 months that we have we'll update our documents on a regular basis. So there's probably many changes coming as we all go through this.
Yeah, it makes me think of even our purchase agreement. Even though it has stated in there multiple times, they're taking the property as is condition. It doesn't matter what's stated on the agreement. They'll find an attorney to fight something. So totally agree with you. There's going to be a lot of changes, and it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Property condition, and again, like this ties in perfectly with our purchase agreement as far as property condition, indemnification as well. So, buyer acknowledges that the brokerage is relying on information provided by the seller or seller's agent regarding condition of any real property and components. We, as a brokerage, strongly recommend that the buyer conduct and not waive inspections and or tests on any real property and components. A buyer understands that all real property, fixtures, equipment may contain defects and conditions that are not apparent or known to the brokerage. Therefore, buyer agrees to indemnify and hold harmless the brokerage from any claims, demands, damages, lawsuits, costs, expenses regarding the condition of the real property they purchase, unless the licensed agent had actual knowledge of the defect or condition. So again, this is where I point back, our purchase agreement has very similar verbiage in it. So it's just in there as far as property condition that, we rely on, these are not our homes. We rely on the information from the seller and then also from that list agent as well, but mostly from the seller. So we have, for our agreement, additional provisions. I will say I'm not a huge fan because most agents are not attorneys. So I don't, my recommendation for Elevate agents would be to put NA unless there's something specific that they can think of that should be in there. Rich and Rick, do you guys have anything of this like this in your agreements or anything that you've seen might be put in something like this?
We don't even have a line for additional provisions, and I don't know that it's something that we, like you said, we're not attorneys, don't write too much. If you have to
Yeah.
write more than a sentence or two, you're practicing law.
The only thing that I've seen that agents have requested to add, and I'm not sure, it is legal that they can do this, is if you have a buyer that instructs you not to show them any homes that are not offering a buyer agent compensation, that is a lawful instruction, but you would want that in writing, whether it's on additional provisions or in an email of some kind. It would go against our ethics as realtors to just simply not do that. That would be considered steering. But if you have a client that absolutely specifically tells you that, that is a lawful instruction. So I can see adding that verbiage, but I would not add it on your own. Let the client tell you they want it added, and they should probably initial next to it. And that's still a slippery slope because we know a very large brokers that's not offering any buyer agent compensation on their listings. So you wouldn't be able to show any of their listings, which could cause a problem.
Yeah, to me then, I mean, you need to have that conversation further with that buyer, to understand like there's multiple factors that go into an offer to make it strong. And so to me, you'd be limiting the potential opportunity to find exactly what you're looking for. So yeah, I think that would be a further conversation to have with the buyer to understand their, just to negate that concern that they might have. And I think that also triggers to me too, I think what's really important, more so now than ever, is having conversations with lenders up front to understand the buyer situation. Do they have funds to, to be able to pay commission? If not, like, what do they need to ask for regarding concessions? So to me, and I also think too, to have trusted lenders that actually know like what the limits are per loan type and things of that nature. So I really think with the lending side of things, to have somebody that actually can communicate and also really inform both the buyer and us as the agents, because we're not lenders, about the buyer situation, I think is so important to know up front. All right. And basically the rest, so obviously it's an entire agreement, a fair housing statement, protecting those classes, is stating. So we have wire fraud in here as well. I don't think wire fraud can be discussed enough, with the amount, if you talk to any title company, the amount of fraud that they have seen. I just think it's really important that we're having those conversations when it comes to wiring funds to make sure that they know. We will never instruct them or give them anything to do with wiring. If and when they do get it from title, they need to call, verify, double check 3 times to make sure before they wire funds that it's going to the right person and account. Because in my experiences, once it's gone, it's almost near impossible to get it back, which is sad, but that's the truth. And then lastly, so this is just signing for the buyer to sign and also for the agent to sign as well. And on ours, there's also an amendment to this agreement. So should anything change, it would, be written here in that section. And then to me, well, actually below, would be signed again by the buyer and by the agent.
Rob, that's a question that's come up a bunch in the chat, is what if your buyer agreement says something less and than what the listing brokerage is offering as a compensation? This is where you would amend it. And while Living is using a different agreement, we also have that same bottom section for amendment. I think Legacy does too. So that's where you would write in the new commission, the higher commission amount. If the buyer's not willing to amend it to say the higher commission amount, you're not getting the higher amount. You can only get what your buyer brokerage agreement says.
And I would also add, I've heard 2 different scenarios. I honestly don't know which one's correct. So I say that because we're all going to make mistakes. I've heard that you cannot amend this agreement based on compensation alone. There would have to be another term. I do not know that that is accurate or not. We honestly, until we start getting into this, we're not going to know a lot of these answers. But I would say just be cautious if you are amending it only on compensation.
Yeah. And here's something that I've had conversations with agents, regarding this and commission percentages. My thought, so if I were in your shoes, I'm not telling you, what it should or shouldn't be. I have a certain amount in my head that I think makes sense that usually you don't see higher co-brokes being offered or, commission amounts being offered. In my eyes, we can always work our way down. It's to me a challenge to work your way up. Because if I say, hey, Mr. Seller, I work for 2.5%, and then, oh, wait, by the way, this one's offering 3, so I should be paid, 3%. To me, I don't know if that's the best look or reputation that I personally would want. So again, that's up to each agent. And I think, as Rich said, we're going to get more direction regarding if it could change just based off of the compensation percentage. So what other questions are out there?
I don't necessarily have a question, but more of a statement. And I'm not sure if Janice is on here. Hopefully she is, but I feel like because open houses do not require, correct, a buyer's
That's
agency.
correct.
So
Correct.
open houses are going to become a big thing again, I have a feeling. And so that being said, I think now more than ever, we need that training protocol that Janice was creating for agents to learn how to properly be certified to host an open house. If we're not hosting our own open houses, we need to make sure that we've got some really savvy agents doing them, because there's probably going to be a lot more traction in that area.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. I think it's a great way to, whether you're experienced or new, I think it's a great way to generate leads. What I love about our brokerages, all of these brokerages, is, everyone's willing to share. Maybe there's an experienced agent that doesn't want to do an open house. We have an open forum regarding, like, hey, do you want to hold this house open, or, things of that nature. So I think it's really important, the culture that we have within these brokerages, to be able to share the listings, because I think open houses are going to be more important than ever. I agree with that.
Open houses are going to be popular. One of the answers, unless Rick or Rob, you've heard something different. I know yesterday we had the attorney present and the MLS, and they did not know the answer to this question, which is, we understand as the listing agent, you can show your own property without having a buyer agent representation agreement signed. However, an open house is the loophole where nobody has to sign a buyer agent rep when you're the listing agent. So the question is, if Rob and I are at the same brokerage and it's Rob's listing, he's the only one on the listing agreement, and I want to hold Rob's open house open, do I have to now have a disclosure that when people walk in the door, that they understand I do not represent the seller? I would be entering into a buyer agency agreement with them, perhaps. So we don't have an answer on that yet. I mean, unless either of you have the answer. Ohio Realtors doesn't have it. NAR hasn't provided it. Our attorneys haven't provided it. So I would just say, if you're doing an open house for another agent in your brokerage, we may be able to get away with it for a while. We may always be able to get away with it, but things could change as we move forward. And then Leah Jones asked the question, can you leave the amount open blank that buyers pay? And the answer is no. You cannot leave anything open-ended when it comes to the compensation or the expiration date on these terms.
So yeah, I do not have an answer either to that. So
I think the answer is really that everything's going to be changing again. And I've been telling my agents, I've already got 3 revisions to our purchase agreement. I just released it on Friday night, and I've already got 3 revisions sitting on my desk that I'd like to make to it. It's all these documents are going to change. All these answers are going to change. I think we just have to be flexible for the next 6 months, 12 months. Maybe it's going to be 24 months, but things are going to continuously change and evolve.
And don't worry about real estate jail. It's not real. Every brokerage is doing this together. So don't have too much trepidation if you make a mistake. We don't even know if you're making a mistake. We might all be making mistakes. To Rick's point, it's change. Everything's going to change. We're going to have some leeway.
Rich, I have a quick question. You mentioned the open house. Let me make sure I understand what you just said. So if I'm holding my own open house, there's no buyer rep agreement needed. But if someone wants to see my own listing, I do not need a buyer's rep?
That's correct. If you are the listing agent, Kathleen, you do, and a buyer calls you off the sign or you're advertising, you can show the property. You still have to have them sign the consumer guide to agency when you show them the property, but you as the listing agent do not have to have them sign a buyer agent representative agreement. So that's scary for the consumer. Go ahead, Rick.
I'm sorry. I'm going to hop in there. I don't know about Legacy and Elevate, but at Living, you would need the consumer guide, like Rich said, but before you walk that buyer through the door, you should be having them sign the unrepresented buyer agreement so that they know that you don't represent them, that you'll treat them honestly and fairly, but don't share any confidential information because you don't have the duty of confidentiality with them. So if it's not an open house, if it's just a sign call, you don't need that buyer rep agreement, but you do need the unrepresented buyer if the intention is that they are unrepresented. If
Yeah,
you're going to
that's
be a dual agent, then get a buyer rep agreement signed.
right. And that's really the thing is if you show the property, so if you're at Elevate and Legacy and you simply show the property without using the unrepresented buyer document, which we don't have at Legacy. So I will just say, and maybe that's something we can look into, but at that point, if the consumer does decide to write an offer on the property, they're going to be unrepresented. I'm assuming, Rick, unless they convert into a client, which at that point you would need to get a buyer representative agreement if you're allowing dual agency.
Yeah, if they're going to convert into a client, then you would need a buyer rep agreement signed. But if you're not acting as a dual agent, then that unrepresented buyer agreement explains that you have your fiduciary duty to your seller. And so
that's
one
gonna
or
bring
the
up
other would be signed unless it's an open house. One or the other would be signed.
Okay. And
Yeah.
I think so what Rick is saying is, sorry, Rob, what Rick
No,
is
go
saying is
ahead.
right, that's fine. I will say I do believe things will continue to change with that because as buyers understand they're not represented, that's really not in the best interest of the consumer. And I can see lawsuits happening because a buyer doesn't understand they're unrepresented and the limits of what you can't do for them. And that's not to Living, Legacy, or Elevate. That's all brokerages, right? I mean, that's the reality of it is buyers need representation. And so if buyers start calling the listing agent and become unrepresented, I can only imagine the lawsuits that are going to happen from that.
Yeah, and my thought too, I mean, if we're showing a house and we have it very similar to Living, which I don't have it yet. I'm waiting on Ohio Realtors to provide that verbiage for, a customer versus a client. It's possible that they could be offering on that property, but it's also possible too that maybe, you show them the home, they don't like the home. I mean, odds are they probably won't like the home or, don't want to make an offer. But again, if you hit it off with them, then you can, possibly convert them to an exclusive buyer rep agreement.
Michaeline, to answer your question in the chat, there is nothing that says that you as the listing brokerage or agent can't shout out to the world what the buyer agent compensation is that you're offering. So you can have it on a rider on the sign, you could advertise it on Facebook or anywhere else you want to, social media wise. You could have I've so far seen on the countertops at showings where there's a little plaque that says, buyer broker friendly. This seller is offering X% commission. There's nothing, as long as it's off the MLS, you can absolutely answer that question.
So one of the things that I do for the Stonebridge condos, because there's so much information that needs to be communicated to agents that are touring that condo building, I just immediately, when I get a text message saying someone's requesting a showing, I don't ever make anything go and show so that I have the ability to easily communicate with any agents looking to tour one of my properties. Because it just comes up in your text. You can easily click on their phone number to send them a message. Before I click on that phone number, I copy and paste from my notes, which is on my phone, exactly when I want to communicate with them, and I just put the buyer's broker commission in there. So it's
That's a great practice.
What's that?
That's a great practice. That's good. Thank you for sharing that because that is good. That's one way to get it out there instead of having going show. Yep.
There was a question early on in the chat about should we be sharing our buyer rep agreements with the listing agents so that we can show them what the commission is supposed to be? Absolutely not. Just like we don't get to see the listing agent's listing agreement to make sure that they're splitting the commission the way it's supposed to be. That's private between the buyer's agent and the buyer. It is no business of a listing agent or a seller. They're not the police of our buyer rep agreements, or even for that matter, verifying that you have a buyer rep agreement before you walk through the door of my listing. That's not my business. If you get audited, that's going to be your problem, not the listing agent's problem. So we shouldn't be sharing our buyer rep agreements, just like we don't share a listing agreement.
Yeah, I'll add to that too, because I called Ohio Realtors attorneys about this specifically, because we've had a few agents that have been required. I think it's interesting too, is it really the listing agent or is it the seller that's requiring it? If I had to guess, for whatever reason, I would think it's the list agent. But regardless, what I was told is legally, yes, they can request it, yet it's a bad business practice because it could potentially limit the amount of buyers that actually want to go. If worst case scenario, if we had to, like, no matter what, to see the home, my recommendation is to redact the important information in there regarding the commission percentage, and anything else that might be applicable.
I have another quick question about multiple offers. And it's just your opinion, anybody's opinion, could shout it out. Do you think people are going to start waiving their commissions? I mean, I wouldn't, but in a multiple offer to win that offer?
But are they going to get paid from their buyer then?
Could be, yes.
Well, if they're getting paid from their buyer, I mean, and it's part of a tool to win that multiple offer, why not? Does the seller have to pay whatever they have in their listing agreement, regardless of whether or not the buyer's agent is going to ask for it?
Can you say that again, Tara? What was the question?
So in the case where you're in multiple offers and you as a buyer's agent come to the table saying, hey, seller and listing agent, I am not going to charge you guys a commission fee. My buyer is paying my commission fee. So that makes me look more appetizing as a selection. But the seller and the list agent have a listing agreement that states the seller is paying X amount to their to their listing agent. Do they have to pay that listing agent regardless of whether or not we are accepting payment from the seller and or the listing agent?
Yeah, the listing agent, they would still have to pay their listing agent, whatever's in the listing agreement, because that's the contract between the seller and the brokerage.
So
we had this happen, and this was probably a month and a half ago. The buyer's agent said, hey, they've agreed to pay me a commission, so we're not asking for. So then the list agent asked me, well, let's just say in this scenario, they had 6% on there, and then they were offering just say 3% as a co-broke. My comment to the agent would be, I don't think it's in the seller's best interest to take that entire 6%. I think you should work with them, just because that other 3% is not being taken by the co-broke agent. Others might disagree with me and try to go for the entire 6%. But to me, I would then work with that seller, because now the buyer's offers, when you do a net, that buyer's offer is more attractive because then you're reducing that, the 6% that the seller said they're willing to offer.
Would that be, but let me ask a quick question. If you got paid by well, it won't be an inducement to sell, would it? In any which way, if someone was paying us?
Well, no, I mean, because we have our exclusive right to sell between the
Correct.
brokerage and the seller, and then the buyer's agent has their buyer rep agreement, exclusive buyer rep agreement between them, their brokerage and that buyer. So me personally, I don't see any inducement there. To answer the first question, I would never recommend anyone work for free. If that was the initial question, as far as, doing no percentage, then what's the purpose of being in the business?
And I'm looking at our exclusive right to sell. And so the way we did our new listing agreement, it splits up the listing commission and the buyer's commission. So it's no longer going to say the total commission, and from that we're sharing this much. So if the buyer says we're not asking the seller to pay. The way that Living's contract is written, I think that the seller would be saving that money. Paragraph 2 in our listing in our commission section says, at seller's election, seller will pay and broker will offer blank percent of full purchase price or exchange of the so
Oh no.
it's not coming from Living, so if the buyer's saying, I'm going to pay my own agent to make it more attractive so that seller you net more, then the seller's saving that money. So it works for our sellers. Leah, you were saying, oh no, I'm not sure what that was for.
No, I'm sorry, Rick. No,
That-
I'm sorry. I wanted to say something, but I'll let you finish and then I'll
No, go ahead.
Okay, I have a separate question. So the question is, under our former buyer agreement that I have been using, because I have been working with a lot of investors, I would put in like my minimum commission and like not a percentage, because some of the price points were maybe like lower. And so I would so I had a minimum commission set. And then what happens is, and I was told that I, could do this, obviously. I know I had spoken to Rick about this prior to me even starting this, but I've been doing buyer agreements. But what I would do is I would put my minimum commission amount. I would not put a percentage, but then whatever the seller side would pay me, if it covered my minimum commission, then the buyer would not have to pay. So on my escrow letter, I kind of separated who pays what. So I think
That doesn't work
just
anymore,
making,
Leah.
that doesn't work anymore.
I'll stop you right there. That does not work anymore because we are not allowed to have
Okay.
open-ended commission structure. So it all needs to be, you can still have a minimum commission. So
Right.
you can, I was just looking at one the other day with a 3% commission, but a minimum, which ended up being like 8.5% because it was a low price point. That's fine because that's not open-ended. So you can still have your minimum in there, but you cannot take more than what's outlined on the agreement.
Right. But can the seller and buyer still split the difference? So that doesn't like because that's how it was prior. The seller was paying out, maybe let's say like the seller was paying like $2,000 and my minimum commission was 1,000. So then on my escrow letter, my buyer would pay my difference to meet my minimum. And that's what I was doing. So I don't know
the
how
commissions may be paid by I'm reading this right off of the contracts, may be paid by the seller, the buyer, the landlord, the tenant, or a third party, or by sharing or splitting the fees and commissions between brokers. So it could be split, but you cannot have that minimum and say, oh, well, they're paying me more, the seller's paying more, so I'm just going to take the higher amount now. You cannot do that anymore.
But I thought you can amend the agreement.
If your buyer agrees to amend it,
Yeah.
it's got to be mutually agreed upon. If your buyer says, no, I'd rather get this for 1% lower purchase price, it nets the seller the same amount, and I'm getting that 1% difference between what you agreed to work for and what the seller was offering, then you can't just take it. It can be amended if the buyer agrees to amend it.
And I'll just chime in too quick, kind of the previous conversation. If the agent representing the buyer says, hey, I'm not going to take any of the commission, the buyer already agreed. What in our agreement, our exclusive buyer rep agreement, it states buyer agrees and consents if list agent or seller or any third party offers buyer's agent compensation to the brokerage shall make reasonable efforts to obtain said compensation. So to me, that's a gray area, because if you just say off the bat, hey, the buyer already agreed to pay me 3%, we don't need it to come from the listing brokerage or from the seller. Are we actually following that agreement? And that's, to me, a gray area. So like we said, in summary, a lot to be worked out, a lot to figure out. I think that we're all doing this is fantastic. I just, just be patient. We are all doing our best to get answers answered as quickly as we can and as accurately as we can. So I appreciate everyone being on this call. I think it's great we're all working together as well, and just be positive. To me, these buyer rep agreements it actually is a very good thing. So I appreciate everyone being here, and have a great Thursday.
If I can just add one last thing, I would say give feedback to your brokers. We need the feedback with our forms. They're going to continue to change. We need your feedback. You're in the field every single day doing this. Our attorneys helped drafted these. They are not realtors. They're real estate attorneys, but they are not realtors. They don't do this every day. So whatever you guys are seeing that we've done in the forms, that was our best first draft, final first draft, I should say. We went through plenty of revisions, but a lot of work went into those, and yet we know they're not perfect. So share your feedback with your brokers so that we can get those right.
All
Thanks,
right.
Rob, for heading this up.
Of course. All right. Thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate it.